The morning started like any other morning in the small town of Clarksville, Tennessee, birds outside the window, the smell of coffee drifting through the hallway, and the soft golden light of October touching the curtains. But for 11-year-old Maya Collins, this particular Tuesday was different from every morning she had lived before. Because this morning, her father was not there to pour that coffee. He had not been there for 7 months, and he would never be there again. Maya sat on the edge of her bed, still in her pajamas, staring at the folded military uniform that rested across the old wooden chair in the corner of her room. It had been sitting there for 3 days. She had placed it there herself, carefully, almost like she was afraid to hurt it. Her mother had found it while going through some of Sergeant David Collins' belongings. His dress uniform, perfectly pressed, decorated with his medals, still carrying the faintest smell of the man who used to wear it. When her mother brought it out of the storage box, Maya had not cried. She had just reached out slowly, touched the fabric with 2 fingers, and asked if she could keep it in her room for a while. Her mother had said yes without asking why. Now it was a school day, and something inside Maya, something quiet and heavy and very certain, told her she needed to wear it. Not as a costume, not to show off, but because she had been walking around for 7 months feeling invisible, and the one person who always made her feel seen was gone. Her father used to say, "Maya, when you wear the uniform, you carry something bigger than yourself." She was only 11. She was small, with thin arms and dark braids that her mother tied every morning. The uniform was enormous on her. The jacket hung past her hips, the sleeves swallowed her hands, and the pants had to be folded up multiple times at the bottom. But she put it on anyway, slowly, carefully, like a kind of prayer. Her mother, Sandra Collins, was standing at the kitchen counter when Maya walked in. Sandra turned around, and when she saw her daughter tiny inside that big olive green jacket, medals pinned above where her heart was, she stopped breathing for a second. She had not expected this. Her first feeling was the sharp edge of grief, the kind that hits you in the middle of a normal moment and knocks the air out of you. Her second feeling was something harder to name, something close to awe. Maya looked up at her mother with those steady brown eyes and said, "I want to take him to school with me today." Sandra Collins was a strong woman. She had held herself together through the funeral, through the folding of the flag, through the nights when she could hear Maya crying softly behind a closed door. But standing in that kitchen, looking at her daughter wearing her husband's uniform, she felt her throat tighten in a way she could not stop. She did not argue. She did not say it was against school rules or that the other kids might stare. She walked to Maya, knelt down, and straightened the collar of the jacket the way David used to straighten it on himself. She kissed Maya on the forehead and said, "He would be proud of you." The walk to school was only 4 blocks, but that morning it felt longer. Maya walked slowly, with both hands holding the sleeves up so they would not drag on the ground. A few neighbors saw her from their porches and said nothing, just watched with that quiet, understanding kind of look that people in military towns carry. Clarksville was a place that knew grief. It was a place that had sent hundreds of its sons and daughters to serve, and not all of them came back. The neighbors recognized the uniform immediately. One older man, a veteran himself, was standing by his mailbox when Maya passed. He looked at her for a long moment, then placed his hand over his heart. Maya saw it and walked a little straighter. She reached the school gates just as the morning bell rang. Kids were everywhere, running, laughing, throwing bags at each other, doing all the normal things that normal children do on a Tuesday morning. And then they started to notice Maya. First one kid, then a small group, then more. The noise did not stop exactly, but it changed, softened, like someone had turned the volume down just slightly. Maya kept walking, her chin lifted, her father's medals catching the morning light. She did not know yet what the day would bring. She did not know that her teacher would have to stop the lesson because half the class was too emotional to focus. She did not know that by the afternoon, her story would have reached every corner of the school. She did not know that a photograph taken by a parent volunteer near the front gate, just a small girl in an oversized uniform, walking alone with her head held high, would be shared by thousands of people before the day was over. She did not know any of that yet. She was just a daughter missing her father, trying to find a way to keep him close on a Tuesday in October. And in that simplicity, in that pure and aching love, she carried something far greater than she understood. Room 14 at Clarksville Elementary was Mrs. Patricia Horn's classroom, and Mrs. Horn had been teaching for 22 years. She had seen children come in crying over broken friendships, children who had lost grandparents, children who struggled silently with things no child should carry. She thought she had seen everything. She was wrong. When Maya Collins walked through the door of room 14 that morning, Mrs. Horn was writing the day's agenda on the whiteboard. She heard the room go quiet behind her, not the anxious quiet of kids waiting to get in trouble, but a different kind of quiet, the kind that happens when something unexpected and deeply human enters a space. She turned around and saw Maya standing in the doorway, dressed in her father's military uniform, the jacket so large that only the tips of her fingers peeked out from the cuffs. Maya's braids were neat. Her back was straight. Her expression was not sad or not only sad. It was something more composed, more deliberate than sadness. Mrs. Horn had known about Sergeant David Collins. Every teacher at this school knew. When a parent dies in active service, the school counselor sends a quiet memo, and the staff adjusts. They watch. They soften their tone. They make small allowances for the child who is walking through something enormous. Mrs. Horn had been watching Maya for 7 months. She had noticed the way Maya sometimes paused in the middle of reading aloud, as if a thought had passed through her and taken her somewhere else. She had noticed that Maya always wrote her father's name when class assignments asked about someone they admired. She had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for this moment, the moment when Maya's grief would stop being invisible. She said nothing at first. She just nodded at Maya's seat and let her walk to it. The other 23 children in the class were completely still, which was its own kind of extraordinary thing for a room full of 11-year-olds. Maya sat down. She placed her hands flat on the desk, those big sleeves folding over the surface, and looked at Mrs. Horn as if ready to begin the day. Mrs. Horn tried to start the lesson. She really did. She turned back to the board and began talking about fractions, denominators and numerators, the kind of material she had taught so many times she could do it with her eyes closed. But she could feel the room. She could feel 23 children who were not thinking about fractions. She could feel them thinking about Maya, about the uniform, about what it meant to lose a parent and love them so much you carried their clothes on your body so you would not feel so far apart. After about 4 minutes, she stopped talking. She put the marker down. She turned around. "Maya," she said gently, "would you like to tell us about your dad?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Maya looked up and something in her face shifted. The composed, careful expression softened just slightly. She nodded. What followed was one of the most remarkable 20 minutes that Room 14 had ever seen. Maya Collins, 11 years old, stood up in front of her class and talked about her father. She talked about how he used to make terrible pancakes on Sunday mornings and laugh about it while eating them anyway. She talked about how he called her his little soldier, not because he wanted her to be tough, but because he said soldiers were the people who showed up even when it was hard. She talked about how he had been deployed twice before and always came back, and how she had been so certain he would come back this time too, because he always did. She talked about the phone calls from overseas, how his voice sounded a little different through the static, but she always knew it was him in the first second. She talked about the morning the uniformed officers came to their door, and how she had known before her mother opened it, known just from the sound of the knock, that something had broken in the world. She did not cry through most of it. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have been holding something for so long that the words have been polished smooth by the inside of their chest. But near the end, when she touched the medals on the jacket and said, "He earned every single one of these," her voice broke, just once, just briefly, and she pressed her lips together and kept going. There were children in that classroom who were crying. A boy named Terrell, who sat in the back and was generally considered too cool to show emotion, had his head turned toward the window and was wiping his face with his sleeve. A girl named Lily had her hand over her mouth. Mrs. Horn herself had tears running down both cheeks and was not trying to hide them. When Maya sat back down, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Mrs. Horn did something she had never done in 22 years of teaching. She began to clap slowly, not the rapid applause of a performance, but the deep, deliberate clap of genuine respect. And one by one, every child in room 14 joined her. Maya sat very still in the middle of it, looking down at her father's medals, her small shoulders finally, beginning to let go of some of the weight they had been carrying. Word travels fast in schools. By second period, 3 other teachers had heard. By lunch, the principal knew. And somewhere near the front entrance of the school, a parent volunteer named Margaret Yee had been taking photos for the school newsletter when Maya arrived that morning. She had snapped one quick picture, a small girl alone in an oversized uniform, walking into the building, and thought nothing more of it. She had no idea that by the time school was over, that photograph would be doing something she never expected. Margaret Yee had posted the photograph on the school's community Facebook page at 8:47 in the morning with a simple caption. One of our students honoring her father, a fallen soldier today. No words. She had not tagged anyone. She had not added a long description. She did not think the post would go far. Maybe a few parents would like it. Maybe the principal would share it to the school's page. She was not prepared for what happened next. By noon, the post had been shared over 4,000 times. By the time the afternoon bell rang, that number had crossed 40,000. People were sharing it from Tennessee to Texas, from Florida to Oregon, from military bases and small towns and cities, from countries that were not even the United States. The comments section was enormous, thousands and thousands of people leaving messages, most of them too overwhelmed to write more than a few words. Veterans were sharing it with their families. Parents were tagging their children. Gold Star families who had lost someone in service, were writing messages that went on for paragraphs, saying things like, "This is my daughter," or "This was me," or "This is what it means to love someone who gave everything." Sandra Collins found out about the photograph at her workplace. She worked as a nurse at the local clinic, and a colleague showed her the phone screen during a break. Sandra stood in the break room and stared at the image of her daughter, tiny, determined, dressed in David's uniform, and the number in the corner that kept climbing. She stepped outside and sat in her car for 10 minutes. She was not angry that the photo had been shared. She was not overwhelmed in a bad way. She felt something she had not felt in 7 months, the sense that her husband was being seen, that his sacrifice was not just a private family loss disappearing quietly into the world, that people were stopping their scrolling and their busy Tuesday lives to look at what their family had given, represented in the small, brave figure of their daughter. She picked Maya up from school herself that afternoon, which was unusual. Maya climbed into the car still wearing the uniform, the sleeves still folded back, the medals still pinned. Sandra looked at her daughter and said, "Baby, a lot of people have seen your photo today." Maya did not fully understand what that meant until they got home and Sandra showed her the screen. Maya sat with the phone in her hands, scrolling through the comments in that careful way children scroll when the information is too big to absorb all at once. She stopped on one comment that had been liked over 10,000 times. It had been written by a man who said he had served alongside Sergeant David Collins. He wrote that David was the kind of soldier who never let anyone feel forgotten, that he had a way of finding the person in the group who was struggling and sitting with them quietly until they felt less alone. He wrote that the Collins family had given something to their country that could never be repaid, and that seeing Maya in that uniform made him feel like David was still standing. Maya read it twice. Then she handed the phone back to her mother, went to her room, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. The school was already responding by evening. Principal James Okafor released a statement saying he was proud of Maya's act of love, and that Clarksville Elementary stood with the Collins family. He said the school would be organizing a Veterans Day memorial event in November, and that Maya would be honored as part of it if her family agreed. Mrs. Horn sent a personal message to Sandra that night, a long, private message that was just between two women who both loved the same child, saying that what Maya had done in that classroom had changed something in those 23 children, that the lesson she had given them was one no textbook had ever managed. By the next morning, local news had picked up the story. A reporter from the Clarksville Leaf Chronicle reached out to Sandra Collins asking if the family would be willing to speak. Sandra thought about it for a day. She talked to Maya, asking if she wanted to share her story with more people. Maya, who was practical in the way that children who have survived hard things often become practical, said, "If it helps someone else who is sad, then yes." So they agreed to a short interview. The story ran on Wednesday afternoon, and then a larger outlet picked it up. Then another. Within 72 hours of Maya walking into school in her father's uniform, her story had been covered by national news. Her name and her father's name was being spoken in places that had never heard of Clarksville, Tennessee. Sergeant David Collins, who had died quietly and without ceremony in a foreign country far from home, was suddenly known. His face, pulled from family photographs Sandra shared, appeared on screens across the country. And America, which was tired and divided and overwhelmed with its own noise, stopped for a moment to look at a little girl in an oversized uniform and remember something it sometimes forgot. That behind every flag, behind every medal, behind every formal announcement of loss, there was a family. There was a daughter. There was a Sunday morning with terrible pancakes, and a voice through static and a knock on the door that changed everything. Maya did not fully understand the scale of what was happening. She was 11. She went to school on Wednesday in her regular clothes, sat in room 14 and did her fractions. But she walked a little differently now. Something had shifted not just for her, but in the air around her. Because for the first time since that knock on the door, she did not feel like her grief was something she was carrying alone in the dark. The letters started arriving on Thursday. Sandra Collins had not expected that. In a world of screens and notifications and everything moving fast, she had not expected people to sit down, take out paper and write. But they did. The school received letters first. The front office began collecting them in a box because there were too many to fit in a single pile. Then the local post office, recognizing the family's name from the news, began routing mail directly to Sandra's address. Some envelopes were small, some were large, some were carefully decorated by children who had drawn pictures of flags and stars on the outside. Some came from across the country. A few came from overseas, from military families stationed in Germany, Japan, South Korea, who had seen the story and felt the need to reach across the distance and say something. Maya sat at the kitchen table every evening that week and read them with her mother. They took turns reading aloud. There was a letter from a 12-year-old girl in Georgia whose mother had been deployed and who said Maya had given her an idea, that she was going to bring her mother's unit patch to school and put it on her backpack so her mom could be with her every day. There was a letter from a retired Army colonel who wrote 3 tight paragraphs about honor and what it meant, and ended with the words, "Your father served his country. You are serving his memory. Both take courage." There was a handwritten note from a woman in her 70s who had lost her son in a different war, decades ago, who wrote that she had thought about him every day for 40 years, and that seeing Maya reminded her that love like that did not wear out with time. It only became something else, something quieter but permanent. One letter made Maya stop completely. It was from a boy named Caleb, 9 years old, from a town in Ohio. His letter was short, only 4 sentences, written in the large, careful handwriting of a young child still learning to make his letters the right size. It said, "My dad is deployed right now and I am scared. I saw your picture and I felt better. You are brave. I hope my dad comes home." Maya read it twice, then folded it very carefully and put it in the shoebox she had begun keeping the most important letters in. That night, with Sandra's help, she wrote Caleb a letter back. She told him that it was okay to be scared. She told him that his dad was thinking about him, she was sure of it. She told him that brave did not mean not being afraid. Her father had told her that once. It meant doing the thing even when you were. She signed it, your friend Maya. Sandra watched her daughter write that letter and felt something she could not quite name, something between heartbreak and wonder. Because Maya was 11. She was supposed to be worried about friendship drama and school projects and what was for dinner. Instead, she was writing comfort to a scared 9-year-old she had never met, drawing on a well of wisdom she should not have had to develop so young. Grief had made her older. Love had made her generous. Somehow, impossibly, it was both sad and beautiful at the same time. The Veterans Day Memorial event at Clarksville Elementary came 3 weeks later, on November 11th. Principal Acaffer had worked with staff and the local veterans community to create something meaningful. The school gymnasium was quiet in a way that gymnasiums rarely are. No squeaking shoes, no bouncing balls. Rows of chairs filled the space. Families had been invited. Several local veterans sat in the front row in full dress uniform. There was a small stage at one end, decorated with flags. Maya had been asked to speak. She had spent 2 evenings with her mother writing what she wanted to say, crossing things out, rewriting, reading it aloud to the mirror. On the morning of the event, she put on her father's uniform one more time. Sandra helped her pin the medals in the correct order. She had looked it up, wanting to get it right. They stood in the bathroom together, mother and daughter, both looking at the reflection. And for a moment the space between grief and love felt very thin, almost like one thing instead of two. When Maya walked onto that stage in front of the full gymnasium, students, teachers, parents, veterans, a few reporters in the back, the room did to her what rooms had been doing since that first Tuesday morning. It went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a scheduled program, but the involuntary quiet of people who feel something real entering the space. She was still small. The uniform was still too large. The medals still caught the light. She stood at the microphone, looked out at the room, and said what she had come to say. She spoke about her father, not the soldier, but the man. She told them about the pancakes again, because she had decided that story was important, that people needed to know he was funny and warm and real before they could truly understand what was lost. She spoke about what it meant to wear his uniform, that it was not about pretending to be him, but about carrying him forward in the only way she knew how. She said, "He always told me that the people who serve do it so the people at home can have ordinary days. He wanted me to have ordinary days. I am going to try to have them. But on the hard days, I put on his jacket, and the hard day gets a little easier." When she stepped back from the microphone, one of the veterans in the front row stood up. Then another. Then they were all standing, the veterans, the teachers, the parents, and the sound of it filled the gymnasium in a way that had nothing to do with noise and everything to do with meaning. Maya stood on that stage, her father's medals on her chest, and she let herself receive it, all that love, all that recognition, all those people honoring something true. She looked up at the ceiling of the gymnasium for just a second, the way people look up when they are speaking to someone who is not in the room. Then she looked back at the crowd and gave them the steadiest, most heartful smile she had. Time moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to grief, indifferent to love, steady and unstoppable. November became December. December became a new year. Maya Collins turned 12 in January, and Sandra baked the chocolate cake that David used to bake, using his handwritten recipe card that still had a smudge of cocoa powder on the corner from the last time he made it. They sang Happy Birthday in a house that was quieter than it used to be, but not empty. Never empty, because a person who was loved that completely does not entirely leave the spaces they filled. The shoebox under Maya's bed was overflowing now. She had started a second one. Letters were still arriving, though less frequently. The world had moved to other stories, the way the world always does. But the people who had written in those first weeks had not forgotten. Caleb from Ohio sent a short update in December to say his dad had come home safely. Maya read that letter standing in the hallway and pressed it to her chest for a moment before adding it to the box. That was a good day. She had started doing something new. Every few weeks, Maya wrote a letter to a Gold Star family, a family like hers who had lost someone in service. She found the names through a nonprofit organization that connected bereaved military families. She did not write about her own loss in detail. She mostly asked questions. Who was your person? What did they love? What made them laugh? She had learned in the months since her father died that one of the loneliest feelings in grief was the fear that people would forget to ask about the person you lost. She did not want other families to feel that. It was a small thing she could do, so she did it. Mrs. Horn saw Maya every school day and noticed the changes in her, not dramatic changes, not the kind that show up all at once, but the slow, steady changes of a child who is grieving honestly and not pretending. Maya laughed more than she had in the autumn. She was still sometimes quiet in a way that carried weight, but she had stopped flinching when other kids talked about their dads. She had stopped going still when Father's Day was mentioned in passing. She carried her father with her now in a way that did not feel like dragging. It felt more like wearing him the way she had worn his jacket. Present, close, warm even in its heaviness. Sandra Collins went back to a grief counselor in the new year. She had tried one briefly after David died and stopped, because at the time she could not afford to fall apart. But now, with Maya more steady, she allowed herself to begin the work of her own healing. She talked about David in those sessions. She talked about the years before deployment, the early years of their marriage, the ordinary evenings that she would give anything to have back. She talked about watching Maya grow into someone remarkable, and how that was both her greatest joy and her greatest ache, because David was missing it. The photograph, the one Margaret Yee had taken on that Tuesday morning in October, had taken on a life of its own in the months that followed. It had been printed in a military honor publication. A veterans organization had used it in a campaign about Gold Star families with Sandra's full permission. Someone had made a small painting of it and sent the original, framed, to the Collins house. It sat now on the mantelpiece next to David's official portrait, a painting of a small girl in an oversized uniform, walking forward, medals catching the light. Sandra sometimes stood in front of it in the mornings and looked at it the way you look at something that holds more truth than you expected from a single image. On the following October, exactly 1 year after Maya had walked to school in her father's jacket, she did it again. She had decided on her own, without telling anyone ahead of time. She simply put on the uniform, ate her breakfast quietly, kissed her mother on the cheek and walked out the door. Sandra watched her go from the kitchen window, one hand resting on the counter, and did not try to hold back what she felt. This time the school was ready in a way. Some of the teachers had seen it before, some of the students remembered, but the new kids, the younger ones who had not been there last year, stopped and stared with the same wide, wondering eyes that the original class had. And the effect was the same, a hush, a recognition, a slowing down. Maya walked through the front gate of Clarksville Elementary in Sergeant David Collins' dress uniform, and the school absorbed her the way it always did, with quiet, collective reverence for something it could feel but not fully articulate. She went to room 14. Mrs. Horn was still her teacher for one more year, and she turned around from the whiteboard and saw Maya, and did not even try to pretend she was unmoved. She just nodded, the same nod as the year before, and let the morning begin. After school, Maya sat on the back porch of their house while the October light came through the trees in long, amber strips the way it does in autumn when the world is beautiful without trying. She had the jacket folded across her lap, and she was running her fingers along the edge of one of the medals. The one she had been told represented valor. She thought about her father. She thought about the pancakes and the static on the phone and the way he called her his little soldier. She thought about Caleb in Ohio and the woman in her 70s and the veteran who wrote 3 paragraphs about honor. She thought about all the letters in the 2 shoeboxes under her bed and about how love, when you shared it, did not get smaller. It got larger. It spread. It found people in other states and other countries and touched them in ways you never planned or predicted. She thought about what it meant to honor someone. She had been told since October of last year that what she did was brave, was moving, was an act of honor. She did not disagree, but she knew more than anyone else the simple truth underneath all of it. She had not worn the uniform to be brave. She had not worn it for the photograph or the letters or the gymnasium full of standing people. She had worn it because she missed her father with every part of herself, and putting on his jacket was the closest she could get to a hug she would never have again. That was all it was at the beginning, and somehow that simplest of truths, one child's love for one lost parent, had traveled further and touched more hearts than any planned, deliberate act of heroism could have. Because real love does not need to be organized. It does not need a stage or a microphone or 40,000 shares. It just needs to be true. And hers was. It always had been. It always would be. She folded the jacket one final time, held it against her chest for a moment, and whispered, "Same time next year, Dad." Then she went inside for dinner, and the October light faded slowly behind the trees, and the world kept turning as it always does, carrying all its grief and all its love forward together, inseparable, into whatever came next.